Spoilers alert, this video contain information about a movie. For a decision that you should watch this on your weekend or not. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing.
In 1939 in London, a teacher named Vera who was looking for extra money was informed by a job search service that a husband and wife named UN Owen, through a letter, wanted Vera to be his assistant and secretary. Vera was told to come to their house, which is an island, an isolated island named Soldier Island, to be precise, on the coast of Devon, because Mr. and Mrs. Owen will invite many guests to the island, and Vera is asked to help them there. Because the salary is very high and she is able to become a permanent employee if her performance is satisfactory, she accepts the offer. Shortly, Vera headed to the harbor by train, and when she got there were already 5 other people who had been invited as guests. They would be ushered across the sea by Narracott in his boat, which had been specially rented by Owen. After a long sea voyage, they arrived at Soldier Island, where they were greeted by 2 assistants who had also been hired by Owen and his wife, namely Thomas and Ethel. These 6 people then escorted to a luxurious house in the middle of the meadow, and there were already 2 other guests who were delivered first, so a total of 10 people. First there is Vera Claythorne, a teacher who was recruited became secretary to Owen's spouse, Philip Lombard, an explorer, Wargrave, a judge, Bloor, a detective, Armstrong, a doctor, MacArthur, a general, and Brent, an expert in religious children's moral education, Marston, a teenager from a wealthy family, and also 2 household assistants namely Thomas and Ethel. It can be seen that they are carrying out their respective activities in the room, such as Brent, who drinks tea, MacArthur, who is looking at a photo of his late wife, Marston, who is a naughty teenager who is consuming illegal drugs, Dr. Armstrong, who is prone to tremors, Wargrave, who is taking medicine for his illness, and also Philip Lombard, who keeps a gun in his drawer. In each of their rooms was a rhyme called 10 Little Soldiers. It was like a nursery rhyme, but it was called 10 Little Soldiers, and then they all disappeared. After getting dressed neatly, they had dinner together with a sumptuous menu of food prepared by Thomas and Ethel, while waiting for the arrival of Mr. Owen and Mrs. Owen as hosts. In the middle of the table were also 10 wax statues of soldiers, and they all remembered the poems of the 10 soldiers, who often told them when they were little, which of these poems were also displayed in many rooms including their own rooms. The 8 people have chatting casually, Wargrave recounting his 40-year career having met many bad people, Dr. Armstrong who turned out to be a military doctor, and General MacArthur who knew Mr. Owen because he was a history observer, even though he had never known Mr. Owen's face. MacArthur said that if U.N. Owen stood for Ulick Norman Owen, and Vera then felt strange, because the name of Owen's mother who recruited him also had the abbreviation U.N. Owen, namely Una Nancy Owen. Why is the name? Can a pair of abbreviated husband and wife names be the same? Then Brent asked when they could meet with the Owen family, and Thomas replied, if there is no telephone on this island to call them both. It is usually Narracott who delivers letters and groceries every morning, so maybe the Owen family will come tomorrow morning together with Narracott. They had a fight and were finally separated by the other one, and Marston apologized and shook Armstrong's hand. After the finish for eating, suddenly a voice echoed throughout the room, saying that if they were all charged with their respective accusations, it was Armstrong who had killed Louise, Brent had killed Beatrice, Bloor had killed Lendor, Vera had killed Cyril, Lombard had killed 21 East African tribesmen, MacArthur had killed Henry, Marston had killed John and Lucy, Wargrave had killed Seaton, then Thomas and Ethel had killed Brady, and the game had just begun. And they immediately looked for the source of the sound, which turned out to be from a gramophone record in a room downstairs that they connected to the house speakers. At the same time, Ethel suddenly fainted in the kitchen and was immediately taken by Thomas to their room. Dr. Armstrong gave sleeping pills to Ethel so she could fall asleep more easily. Then, when Armstrong was just leaving the room, he heard Ethel, who was scared, and Thomas asked her rudely to be quiet. After that, Thomas was asked to get together to explain, who are these Owens really? But it turned out that Thomas and Ethel had never met Owen either. They had only been hired by Mail, who had also been asked to turn on the tape at exactly that hour, as a surprise, as well as 8 other guests who never knew the figure of the Owen family. Then Thomas tells that he and Ethel used to work for a very long time for Mrs. Brady, who was considered her own family, but because Brady did not leave much of an inheritance to them at the end of her life, with Thomas's desperation, he killed her using a pillow. They finally told each other the murders they had committed. Dr. Armstrong accidentally killed Louise, who was his patient, because at that time Louise had to operate with a high risk of death. General MacArthur killed his best young soldier, Henry, who died in the mission he gave, and Wargrave killed Seaton because Seaton was indeed the accused, who should be sentenced to death because of his case. Detective Bloor caught Lendor for being a criminal and drunkard, but Lendor died because he choked on his own vomit. Vera used to be the caretaker of a small child named Cyril, and one day Cyril swam in the ocean without Vera's knowledge, and finally drowned. Even Vera, who couldn't swim, tried to save Cyril and she was almost died too. Philip Lombard confessed to his actions that killed 21 East African tribes without any remorse at all, strictly speaking, and the only person there who admitted to atrocities was Lombard. Lombard said, "If all the confessions of the people there are full of lies, as if they did not admit their actions, by reason of unintentional killing or unexpected incidents. Moreover, Brent has not admitted her actions and Marston has also forgotten about his two victims." When they were about to rest, Marston then remembered the names John and Lucy, where they were two children who were run over by running on the road, but Marston instead blamed the child's parents for not being able to take care of the child. Dr. Armstrong, who was previously grazed, also blamed Marston's very violent deed. Then suddenly, Marston died choking on his own drink, even vomiting blood. Then Lombard, Armstrong, and Blore found the forbidden drugs that were kept by Marston, and that could be the cause of Marston's death. That night, while sleeping, Ethel had a dream that she witnessed Thomas killing Mrs. Brady, and since then she has been very traumatized because Thomas always torments her so as not to reveal their dark secret. Not long after, Ethel woke up to a knock on her bedroom door, and someone had entered her room. The next day, Thomas woke Armstrong at dawn to check on Ethel's condition, which was very odd. It turned out that after being examined, Ethel had died a few hours ago. Vera, who knew that, immediately took Armstrong into the dining room and showed him the wax statue of a soldier on the table, whose number had decreased by 2 and is now 8, as if showing the remaining people still alive on the island. Because Thomas said, if he was on the island since a week ago and never saw the Owen family, Lombard also thought, if Mr. and Mrs. Owen were hiding under the rocks, he also checked there with Detective Blore, but no one was there. After that, they both came back and met with Armstrong. And finally, there was a loud noise from Marston's room, and Lombard thought it must be Owen. He immediately prepared a gun and opened the bedroom door, but it turned out to be Thomas, who just took the tent under the mattress for his bed tonight, because there can't be one bed with Ethel's corpse. After meeting MacArthur on the cliff, Vera then returned home to see Wargrave, who was sunbathing. Then she chatted with Brent, who finally told her, who is Beatrice really? Beatrice was a girl abandoned from the war who became a servant, and one day, Beatrice was pregnant, and Brent was angry and kicked her out of the house. Then, Beatrice, who was desperate, finally crashed herself into the train. The next morning, Armstrong suddenly rang the gong to wake everyone up, because it turned out that when he was going to ask for coffee, he saw the corpse of Thomas, who had been horribly killed, with his stomach cut with an axe until his internal organs broke out, according to the next rhyme, namely, 7 little soldiers with a wooden axe and 1 axe, and the remaining is 6. Armstrong realizes that Anon wants to play with them exactly like the next rhyme, but he is sure there will be no more victims, because the next rhyme is that people die from bee stings, and on that island, there are no bee stings. Vera immediately slapped Armstrong, who was getting hysterical, and then asked everyone to stay calm. Lombard and Bloor then moved Thomas's body to his room and next door to Ethel's, then cleaned up Thomas's blood in a dip. Armstrong suddenly rang the gong to wake everyone up, because it turned out that when he was going to ask for coffee, he saw the corpse of Thomas, who had been horribly killed, with his stomach cut with an axe until his internal organs broke out, according to the next rhyme, namely, 7 little soldiers with a wooden axe and 1 axe, and the remaining is 6. Armstrong realizes that Anon wants to play with them exactly like the next rhyme, but he is sure there will be no more victims, because the next rhyme is that people die from bee stings, and on that island, there are no bee stings. Vera immediately slapped Armstrong, who was getting hysterical, and then asked everyone to stay calm. Lombard and Bloor then moved Thomas's body to his room and next door to Ethel's, then cleaned up Thomas's blood in a different place. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Armstrong asked Wargrave to cooperate, as he did not trust the other one, and went to watch Vera, who was making drinks for them, while Brent didn't want to drink the coffee made by Vera, for fear that there was poison in it. Vera came to the dining room as she was about to return to her room. To Vera's surprise, there were only 5 wax statues of soldiers left. At that moment, Vera immediately rang the gong for everyone to gather, and it turned out that the next person to die was Brent, who was injected with poison, like a bee sting. After Brent's body was moved to her room and covered up, Lombard returned to his room in a panic because his gun had been stolen, meaning that one of them had a spare key to the room, which Thomas probably kept. Mutual accusations occurred between Lombard and Armstrong because Armstrong found Thomas's body the first time and Lombard was the one who cleaned Thomas's body. Armstrong even accused Lombard of keeping his gun so that the perpetrator's accusations would not point at him. Bloor also accused Lombard, but Lombard accused him back because Bloor was the last to go down to Thomas's death, and Lombard argued that if Bloor took the spare key, then went back to his room and waited for people to come downstairs before silently taking out the key from Lombard's room. Bloor, on the other hand, claimed that if he didn't have the spare key and the gun, he would be late because he had constipation and had been in the bathroom for too long. The 5 of them together checked their respective rooms and also the entire room there, but the spare key or gun was still not found. They then ate canned food and looked at each other suspiciously. On the other hand, the scene shows a spare key and also a gun, which turns out to be stored in a place they never suspected, in the mouth of a bare rug. Heavy rain, the electricity still off, and 5 corpses in the room made the night atmosphere in the luxurious house even more scary. They then decided they could only go together, or only one person, so there would be no more murders. They ate sober food and drank tea while talking to each other. Lombard asked Wargrave, is it true that he often hangs his defendants, and, according to Bloor, Wargrave was also directly watching when the people got their punishment. Wargrave then stated that it was true if he was going to sentence to death someone who deserved to die and also witnessed their punishment as a sign of accountability. They discussed Edward Seaton, who according to the newspapers was declared innocent, but Wargrave stated emphatically that if Seaton was indeed guilty, because there is evidence of his book, which contains all of his crazy and evil thoughts. On the day Seaton was hanged, even to this day, Wargrave feels that he is still haunted by Seaton's figure. After that, they stayed in one room, except for Wargrave, who wanted to read books in another room, because one person leaving wouldn't be a problem. In that room, Lombard and Bloor suspected Wargrave of being the culprit because he had the same purpose as the killers in that house, which was to punish the guilty. According to Bloor, at this moment, Wargrave alone could be planning another murder. Because Vera was fed up with this situation and these assumptions, she went to her room to sleep and allowed them to keep watching her. At that time, Vera's feelings were very uneasy. Her past memories returned. In the past, Vera finally had a relationship with Hugo. They even made love on the beach. Vera was increasingly frightened. She then saw Cyril's figure many times, even to the point that she felt strangled, which in the end made her faint. Because of Vera's screams, Lombard, Bloor, and Armstrong immediately came to help her, and they took turns leaving the room. Armstrong took the medicine, Bloor took the drink, and Lombard took the wine to bring Vera down, where they asked why there was an iron hanger on the roof of Vera's room, even though they didn't have an iron hanger like that in their room. After drinking, they realized why Wargrave didn't come, even though Vera's scream was very loud. It turned out that, again, the person they suspected was dead. Wargrave was killed by a shot in the head while wearing a wig typical of British judges. After Wargrave's corpse was moved to his room and covered in cloth, the three remaining men accused each other of having left the room when they woke Vera, but still no one could prove that. As usual, Wargrave's death was the same as the verse, 5 little soldiers to court, get a concubine, and 4 left, as well as the number of wax figures that have been adjusted. A sense of hopelessness and fear, without realizing it, makes them consume marijuana to calm down and forget about the problems for a while. While enjoying the effects of cannabis, Armstrong tells Bloor how intimate Lombard and Vera are, and Armstrong says they could actually be Mr. and Mrs. Owen. In her room, Vera recalls the moment after Cyril's death, when, because she was so stressed, traumatized, and feeling guilty, she was admitted to a mental hospital. Hugo had visited her and said, if he is going to take Cyril's mother to another city, in order to forget about the death of her child, Vera then invites Hugo to live with her, but he prefers to meet his girlfriend again. Unfortunately, Armstrong could not be found on the island, and suddenly there were 3 wax figures on the table, as well as Lombard's gun, which was strangely on his bed. Lombard and Bloor had accused each other of having killed Armstrong. Unfortunately, Armstrong could not be found on the island, and suddenly there were 3 wax figures on the table, as well as Lombard's gun, which was strangely on his bed. Similarly, they had suspicions from the start of the murder, which led to Armstrong. Then Bloor admitted that Landor did not die by himself but was killed by Bloor by being stepped on many times until his face was deformed. Now they plan to kill Armstrong, who is still on the prowl, and set fire to the cliff at night in the hopes that someone will see and help them. Shortly, Vera and Lombard packed their clothes and went to the cliff, and evidently, he did. 3. Even though Vera deliberately let Cyril drown to death, her purpose was to make her mother, who is wealthy. Vera wants to pass her fortune to Hugo, and Vera hopes to marry Hugo and live a luxurious life. But the plan failed because it turned out that Hugo realized that Vera had deliberately let Cyril drown, and he was disgusted by Vera's behavior. Hugo hoped that Vera would hang herself. Vera deliberately let Cyril drown to death. Her purpose was to make her mother, who is wealthy. Vera wants to pass her fortune to Hugo, and Vera hopes to marry Hugo and live a luxurious life. But the plan failed because it turned out that Hugo realized that Vera had deliberately let Cyril drown, and he was disgusted by Vera's behavior. Hugo hoped that Vera would hang herself. If only Hugo had strong evidence, that would have been the reason why Vera was traumatized and entered a mental hospital, because she was very heartbroken and also failed to get the inheritance. Vera, who was alone on the island, then felt very safe and calm. She returned to the luxurious house smiling and imagining Cyril holding her hand, but when Vera entered her room, the iron hanger that was not originally on the roof of the room now had a rope attached to it and was also hanging on the chair below. Of course, Vera, who was emotionally unstable, felt very guilty and thought of Hugo, who wanted her to hang herself. Unconsciously, Vera suggested and climbed onto the chair and put a rope around her neck. Not long after that, the bedroom door was opened, and she thought it was Hugo. Unexpectedly, it turned out that Wargrave was the true unknown, and Vera, who was very surprised and slipped from the chair, but her feet were still barely touching the wood, was still barely touching the floor. Armstrong once asked Wargrave to cooperate, and Wargrave took advantage of this by playing dead with a gun mark on his forehead, and Armstrong, who was tasked with asking everyone to immediately bring the body to the room without checking the traces of the shot, was still barely touching the floor, but that was just a trick to kill Armstrong. According to the rhyme, the little soldier was eaten by the red herring, as well as other murders that could be carried out easily. Because who would suspect Wargrave? The first is obviously to bring the guilty to justice, but the second reason is because he was inspired by the figure of Seaton, saw Seaton's notebook, and knew that Wargrave admired his way of thinking. He wanted to do a work of art at the end of his life, which is not very long. Furthermore, Wargrave had felt satisfied when he saw a death since he was a child, and added to his 40 years of career, He always saw people who were sentenced to death. Obviously, it shook his soul. And finally, Wargrave's incurable disease forced him to create the most extraordinary works of art, that is, a work of art of murder that will shock the entire world, that on the isolated island there are only corpses, without any perpetrators. Because Wargrave intends to end his own life after this, Wargrave has also targeted Vera to be the last person alive from the start, because she is the most haunted by past mistakes and her emotions are unstable. An iron hanger has even been prepared only in Vera's room.
Thank you for watching. Watch next movie from my button.